In this last video, I'll discuss the most commonly used model of personality today, the Big Five. In the previous video, we covered Sigmund Freud's psychodynamic perspective. As we discussed, although Freud's ideas were influential, they haven't been particularly well supported by empirical research. So, what theories do modern personality psychologists use to guide their thinking? By far, the most commonly used model of personality today is called the Big Five. Unlike Freud's psychodynamic theory, which was based on Freud's own ideas and largely untestable, the Big Five is empirically driven and based on research. The origin of the Big Five is something called the lexical hypothesis. This is the basic idea that important concepts in a given culture will be expressed in that culture's language. In other words, if something is important, we'll have a word for it. For example, I used to hear growing up that Eskimos, an indigenous people living near the Arctic Circle, have upwards of 30 words for snow. That is, they might have a different word for snow that is soft versus hard, or for different kinds of ice that are more or less safe to walk on. I've since heard that the 30 words is a bit of an exaggeration, but that they do in fact have more words for snow than we do in more temperate climates. And that makes sense. If snow is a really big part of your life, and in fact your very physical safety depends on knowing what kinds of snow and ice are safe or dangerous for different kinds of tasks, it's helpful to have one word to quickly label and communicate that to other people. So what does this have to do with personality? Well, in every language, it's important to be able to describe people and their key individual differences, such as people who are more or less kind, more or less responsible, or more or less trustworthy, etc. In other words, just like different kinds of snow are important to indigenous cultures living in Arctic environments, differences in people's personalities are important for all cultures. Every language should therefore already have words encoded that represent meaningful personality traits. Importantly, this means we can use the words in our language to study personality and to discern which traits are most important and/or universal. In the 1980s, several different American research teams did just that. They looked at the dictionary for English words that are used to describe people, such as kind, angry, noble, responsible, etc. They then used a highly advanced statistical technique called factor analysis to analyze these words. Factor analysis looks at the underlying correlations between data points in order to sort that data into similar categories. In this case, for example, words like kind, nice, generous, and cooperative would likely be highly correlated. The factor analysis would pick up on the fact that these words go together, so to speak, and put them in the same category. The goal of factor analysis is to come up with enough categories that are needed to capture each data point, but no more. Over and over again, these different research teams came up with the same 5-factor solution. In other words, all the different words we use to describe people can be meaningfully sorted into just 5 large factors or categories. For this reason, the Big Five are also sometimes referred to as the 5-factor model. These 5 factors are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. A handy acronym to remember them all is OCEAN. Let's take a look now at each one. First, openness, sometimes called openness to experience, refers to people's enjoyment of novelty, as well as their interests in intellectual and artistic activities. People who score high on openness generally like to try new things. They might enjoy visiting new places, trying exotic foods, or going on new adventures. They also like playing with new ideas and going to cultural activities like the art museum or the orchestra. In contrast, people who score low on openness strongly prefer routine. In the words of Sam Gosling, they know what they like, and they like what they know. Next, conscientiousness describes how responsible, orderly, and achievement-striving someone is. A classic example of someone high on conscientiousness is Hermione Granger from the Harry Potter series, or Monica Geller from the Friends TV show. Both women like to keep things clean and orderly, and they regularly strive to do well in their studies and jobs. In contrast, people who score low on conscientiousness are generally not as achievement-striving, and they may be a bit more disorganized. Extroversion is a term you probably already use in your everyday language, and it pretty much means the same thing as how you use it. People who score high on extroversion are sociable. They like to be around other people. They also tend to be very cheerful, socially dominant, and assertive. In contrast, people who score low on extroversion would be more introverted. That is, they're not as talkative, gregarious, assertive, or outgoing. Agreeableness has to do with how much you are motivated to get along with and cooperate with others. People who are high in agreeableness tend to be cooperative, trusting, and forgiving of other people. They prefer not to rock the boat, so to speak. They're not total pushovers, but they also don't insist on getting their own way all the time. In contrast, people who are lower on agreeableness are more uncooperative and untrusting of other people. They don't mind getting into arguments or holding grudges. Lastly, neuroticism has to do with people's sensitivity to negative emotions, such as worry, depression, and anger. People who score high on neuroticism are especially prone to experiencing these kinds of negative emotions. They're always on guard for what could go wrong in a given situation. In contrast, people who score low on neuroticism tend to be cool cucumbers. They usually keep a level head, even in distressing situations. Neuroticism is also sometimes referred to as emotional stability, which is basically just the inverse. If you're high in emotional stability, that means you're low in neuroticism, and vice versa. You might have noticed that as I described each trait, I talked about scoring high or low on that trait. This is because, unlike the Myers-Briggs or 16 personalities, which put people into discrete boxes or categories, the trait model proposes that each trait is a continuous score. In other words, people aren't only extroverted or only introverted. Rather, extroversion and introversion are opposite ends of the same continuum, and it's possible to score high, low, or anywhere between on this dimension. The same goes for the other 4 traits. Additionally, research shows that people's scores on these traits appear to be normally distributed. Remember this term from Module 2.2. This means that most people score in the middle, as you can see here on this graph. So most people, in fact, are not only an extrovert or only an introvert. While people might lean one direction or another, most people score toward the middle of this continuum, and again, the same goes for the other 4 traits. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the Big Five is the most commonly used model of personality today. Why? A big reason is that the Big Five model has been well supported by scientific research. We can design objective scales that measure Big Five traits, and these scales have been validated by empirical studies. And you can actually take one of these scales yourself at the bottom of your NOVA reading if you're interested. First, these scales appear to be reliable. That is, they give consistent results over time. For example, I score very low on extroversion, around the first percentile. In other words, I'm a huge introvert. And although my score might change a little bit, it stays pretty consistent each time I take the test. However, although the Big Five traits do appear to be relatively stable, people's scores on these traits can change a little over long periods of time. For example, developmental research has found that most people show small increases in agreeableness, conscientiousness, and emotional stability as they get older. And the good news is that the people who change the most on their Big Five scores are precisely those who want to change. Additionally, measures of the Big Five traits, both self and informant reports, have been shown to be valid. That is, they're accurate, and we know this because they predict relevant behaviors. For example, people who self-report being higher on conscientiousness tend to do better at school and work. Adolescents who report scoring lower on agreeableness are more likely to demonstrate aggressive behaviors. And people who score higher on extroversion tend to have larger friend networks, and they self-report being more satisfied with those friendships. An important caveat here, though, is that although traits and behaviors might be correlated on average, this is not necessarily true for every person in every situation. Rather, remember that behavior is always a product of both the person and the environment. For example, as this funny graphic demonstrates, you probably wouldn't blast your personal music at work, even if it's something you'd normally do when you're by yourself at home. So our personality doesn't 100% determine what we will do in any given situation. Each person and each situation is unique, and just because someone scores high or low on extroversion, for example, doesn't guarantee that they will behave a certain way in a given situation. As an example from my own life, even though I'm very introverted, I have a job that often requires that I get up and speak in a somewhat animated tone to large groups of students. On these occasions, I willingly act a little more extroverted than I usually prefer because of the demands of the situation. Maybe you can think of other examples in your own life when you have acted outside of your normal behavioral tendencies because of situational expectations. In other words, traits describe how we generally act on average, but they're not always good predictors of how we will behave in a specific situation. So we know that we can measure the Big Five in reliable and accurate ways, and that's one reason why this is a popular model of personality used by researchers today. Another reason is that the traits have been shown to be relatively universal. Although different people might each have different scores on, say, conscientiousness, the dimension itself, regardless of where you score on it, is relevant for describing and predicting behavior for everyone. In other words, you might score high on conscientiousness, or you might score low, but either way, it's a useful way to describe your typical pattern of behavior. At least in English-speaking samples, where the Big Five were originally developed, the universality of these traits appears very well supported. But what about other cultures and other languages? Over the past decade, studies using translated scales measuring each of the Big Five traits have found broad support in many different countries. However, when other studies attempt to replicate the same factor analysis technique with languages other than English, the results have been a little more mixed. For example, in some languages, 7 factors appear to emerge, whereas in other languages it might only be 3. In all, extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness appear to replicate the most consistently across different cultures, whereas openness appears to be the least consistent. Despite its popularity, however, the Big Five is also not without its critics. First, some people have argued that we actually need to include a 6th personality trait. In this revised model, called the hexaco model, a 6th category, honesty humility, is added to refer to how sincere, honest, and fair someone is. A more fundamental critique of the Big Five has to do with the trait perspective itself. Some researchers don't like using broad traits, like extroversion or openness, as a model for personality because these traits are very general. On the one hand, this generality is actually an asset. Because the Big Five are hypothesized to be relevant for anyone and everyone, it allows researchers to use this model in any population that they study. On the other hand, it also clearly does not capture all of the idiosyncrasies that make each person unique. 2 people could have the exact same extroversion score, for example, but that extroversion might look different depending on each person's unique interests, hobbies, and mannerisms, etc. In this video, I talked about the Big Five model of personality. For the exam, you should be able to define lexical hypothesis and explain what role it played in the Big Five development. Define and describe each of the Big Five personality traits, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and eroticism, and identify each in an example. Describe 2 reasons why the Big Five model is widely used today by modern personality psychologists. Describe 2 critiques of the Big Five model, and describe the difference between the hexaco model and the Big Five.